Good morning, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. This morning, as I was discussing last week, we are in the chapter 12 of the Gita, and I can certainly say this is at least one of my favorites, if not my most favorite chapter in the Gita. It is the chapter on Bhakti Yoga or devotion, and as usual, I'm going to start this morning also with a piece of music. I thought I'll share an Indian song today with all of you because I've not done that in a while. This song that I'm going to share with you today is a poem written by Meera by Saint Meera, who Master refers to a couple of times in the autobiography of a yogi, who was a great saint of devotion who lived in India a few hundred years ago. And after I share a few verses of this song, I'll also give you the meaning of this poem. कुंजन बन चाड़ी है माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम। कुंजन बन चाड़ी है माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम। जो मैं होती जल की मचरिया, प्रभु करते हो स्नान। जो मैं होती जल की मचरिया, प्रभु करते हो स्नान। चरण छुलेती है माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम। चरण छुलेती है माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम। जो मैं होती बन की कोयलिया, गया चरावन आते। जो मैं होती वन की कोयलिया, गया चरावन आते। लोरिया सुनाती है माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम। कुंजन बन चाड़ी है माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम माधो, कहाँ जाऊँ गुणधाम। That's such a beautiful devotional poem written by Meera. I'll give you the meaning of just the first couple of verses. Krishna, I have roamed everywhere. Where shall I go next? What will be my next destination? Maybe I'll incarnate again as a fish in the river where you swim so I can nibble on your feet. Maybe I will incarnate as a singing nightingale in the forest where you graze all the cows. That way you will hear my voice, I can please you with my songs. And she goes on to contemplate on all the incarnations that she can take to please Krishna and to be with him in various different forms. Let's just meditate briefly now on that devotion of Saint Meera, that desire to always be close with the Lord. Om Shanti. Namaste again, friends. Welcome to chapter 12 of the Bhagavad Gita once again. This is such a beautiful chapter, and I think, as I was mentioning last week, it comes at this beautiful point even in the scripture. After all this philosophical exposition for the first 8 or 9 chapters, where Krishna goes deep into the Vedanta philosophy, he explores the nature of renunciation, he teaches meditation and discusses all of this with Arjuna, and then he finally reveals his cosmic form. He gives Arjuna the taste of the experience of that ecstasy. And now they're so close, they're so intimate, brought together by Arjuna's receptivity, deepened by this experience, and Krishna's own closeness with his devotee. And he is now sharing these teachings of bhakti or devotion, of how to always be close with the Lord, how to always have our hearts open, and which is the quickest way to make spiritual progress. And today I'm actually going to share a set of verses. I think the last verse that I shared was the 4th verse of chapter 12. I don't quite remember. In this episode, I want to share, I'm going to read verse 11 of chapter 12. Let me start there, and I'm going to read English translation of a few other verses. This is verse 11 of chapter 12 of the Gita. Ataita dapya shakto asi kartum madhyogam ashritaha sarva karma palatyagam tataha kuru yatatmavan. Now, I'm going to read the translation, but for reasons that I'll explain, I'm going to not read Swami Kriyananda's translation, but I'm going to read Sir Edwin Arnold's translation of these verses. In fact, Swami Kriyananda also often used to quote Sir Edwin Arnold's translations of these verses more than his own. It's actually because Swamiji gave the literal translation of these verses, but Sir Edwin Arnold's translation is more a poetic expression of the essence of what Krishna is communicating, and it's so beautiful. I don't quite know the history of who Sir Edwin Arnold was. I just know that his his translation of the Gita, which is more as a free verse in poetry, not verse by verse, was widely popular. It is, I think, one of the earliest translations that became popular in the West, and I believe, if I'm not wrong, it existed even during Master's times. So even Yogananda ji referred to this translation, if I'm not wrong. And I'm going to read a whole section of verses ending with the verse that I just read. And I'll start with, I think, verse 6 or 7 of chapter 12, because this translation is not divided by verse. I don't know where he's exactly starting. And this is Sir Edwin Arnold's version. Clasp me with heart and mind, so shalt thou dwell surely with me on high. But if thy thought droops from such height, if thou beest weak to set body and soul upon me constantly, despair not. Give me lower service. Seek to reach me, worshipping with steadfast will. And if thou canst not worship me steadfastly, work for me. Toil in works pleasing to me. For he that laboureth right for love of me shall finally attain me. But if in this thy faint heart fails, bring me thy failure. And that was the verse that I just read in Sanskrit. If in this too, Arjuna, you're not as successful, that is okay. Just give up the fruits of all that you're doing. Bring me thy failure. It is such a beautiful, comforting, almost poignant promise that Krishna makes in the Gita. And it is so important for us to understand, because this is the essence of devotion, to be able to offer everything back up to the Lord. And Krishna just gives so many gradations of how one can seek the state of yoga, starting with, you can be absorbed in me all the time, in deep meditation, constantly engrossed in my presence, body, mind, and soul. And then he says, oh, but if that's not possible for you, why don't you engage in devotion? Why don't you engage in devotional acts? Why don't you offer things to me, sing for me, do rituals, practice other things that help affirm that devotion, and that way you can always be in communion with me. And then he says, but if that too is not possible for you, if that is not something that is feasible for you to do, then do works that are pleasing to me. Serve through your body. Go do good works. Serve others who are my devotees. please serve everybody in my name, because those who work in my name, they're the ones who are most pleasing to me, and they will attain me. But then the most beautiful of promises comes after that, where Krishna says, but even in that, if thy faint heart fails, bring me thy failure. What a beautiful promise. I think about this verse often, and if you notice in your own life, assuming all of you are in some way spiritually seeking, you will see that it is often easier to bring our successes to God, and it's much harder to bring God our failures. Think about it. If you've been on a retreat for a long time, if you've had consistent success in keeping up to your daily practices, if you've been able to go deeper in your meditation, wouldn't you feel closer to God? Wouldn't you feel that you've somehow made some spiritual progress? But at the same time, as soon as things start faltering a little bit, maybe your life is stressful and you're busy with other things and you're not able to spend as much time as you used to do in meditation, or maybe your meditations are not as deep as they used to be. Maybe you're having physical health challenges that are keeping you from your practices or whatever they are. Now, don't you think during those times we go into this automatic mindset of just feeling that we are farther away from God? Somehow things have been kept from us that now we have to strive harder to reach God. And here Krishna is dispelling that myth just with this one verse. He almost presents these gradations of how to offer oneself, how to seek the state of union. But in truth, what Krishna is saying is, Arjuna, you will attain me through all these different ways. In essence, these are not different. In fact, that is the best way to approach the spiritual path. It might seem to us that being engrossed in meditation and hours of meditation and being able to, worship God all the time, being able to practice these things is somehow the only mark of spiritual success. And we ourselves go through our lives, thinking that somehow we can externally clear all these pieces out. We can put everything together. Now I'm only able to meditate for 1 hour every day, but soon when I'm able to get done with this commitment, when I'm able to retire, when I'm able to move to that town, then I'll be able to meditate more. Then I'll get everything in order. I don't get to yoga now. I don't get to chant. But soon when I get there, I'll be able to do that. Or, whatever stories we tell ourselves. We often have this notion that we can see God, that God will be with us in the future. But almost it's a little cliche to say that, but there's only the present. There's no future where we can be with God. We can be with God as much in the current moment as we can be in the future, as we were in the past. And the only way to do that is to offer everything up, to not have those visions or stories that we tell ourselves, to imagine that spiritual success looks a certain way. Spiritual success is simply that state of constant communion. We have a book study group that my friends and I are a part of on Monday nights. And somebody brought up this chapter from the autobiography of a yogi with the levitating saint. And they were quoting this line where Badri Mahashaya, that's his name, he was associated with Yogananda ji during his childhood days when he was living in Kolkata. And Yogananda ji seeks out this saint and spends time with him, and he asks Yogananda, have you had anubhava? Have you had the experience of God? You talk about all the techniques and all the meditation that you do. I know that you are very disciplined with your practices. But what do you have to show me in terms of actual experience of the divine? And Yogananda ji does not have an answer. Of course, he was playing this game. He, of course, had that state of consciousness of an avatar even when he was a child. And then, Badri Mahashaya shares some pearls of wisdom in that exchange. And then he goes on to say, do not mistake the techniques for the goal. And today morning, as I was thinking about it, of course, I read that line yesterday because it is so relevant to what we are discussing. Let's not mistake the techniques for the goal, because the goal is constant communion. The goal is to always be able to think of God no matter what we are doing, whether it's in meditation, whether it's in activity. And nothing we bring to God is too small. Again, it's so important for us to realize that in every cell of our being, to always remember, not even realize, to always remind ourselves that nothing we bring is too small in front of God. There is this story from Ramakrishna's life where some devotee came to Ramakrishna and he was sharing, and this devotee was being very boastful and egotistical, I think even without being all that aware of it. And he was saying and listing to Ramakrishna all the great deeds of charity that he had done, how he had donated this much money to this temple, how he had made this shrine happen in this small town, and how he was using all of his wealth to serve God in many different ways. And he did not even think there was any ego in there. He just thought he was telling Ramakrishna how hard he was trying to be devoted to God and to serve him through the wealth that God had given him. And Ramakrishna, in his childlike nature, he laughed and he said, I wonder how Divine Mother got along before you came. Before you built all these temples, how did she manage? It's almost funny and humorous, but if you think about it, God does not need anything from us. God does not need our meditation practice. God does not need offerings. God does not need to be pleased by all the rituals. In one of Yoganandaji's recorded audio talks, there are a few of those which you can easily find on the internet or you can purchase from Self-Realization Fellowship. You can hear in Master's voice, where we often talk about pleasing the Lord, praising the Lord. And he says, when you keep saying that, when you keep talk of praising the Lord, you almost imagine the Lord as this old lady who's looking to be pampered. I think that's exactly what he says. And then he goes on to say, all that God wants is our love. Everything in this universe he has, everything in this universe he is. The one thing that he is waiting for is the love of the human heart. That he does not have already. That's why he's always seeking. I think it was in the last episode, I don't quite remember, I was sharing the story of Krishna and Radha, even in the town of Vrindavan. Even today, the tradition is that Radha is honored more. And in a symbolic way, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, as we see again and again, it is said that way, it is expressed that way because Radha is also a symbol for devotion. And in all of Krishna's childhood stories, you see that all the gopis are pursuing Krishna and Krishna is pursuing Radha. And that story is so metaphorical because all these gopis pursuing Krishna are all the devotees, all the noble traits in us that are always seeking God. And what is God seeking? God is seeking devotion. God is seeking Radha. He is always in pursuit of that love. And that's really all that we have to offer to Lord. It doesn't matter what form it takes. And the scriptures of all traditions, all religions are filled with so many stories. I was thinking of a few stories to share today morning, and so many came to me. I'll perhaps share one or two. I don't know how much time I have. I'll start with this story, again from the Srimad Bhagavatam. This is a story that some of you may have heard of. This was of a devotee of Krishna by name Sudama. And Sudama and Krishna grew up together in Vrindavan, in Gokul, where Krishna was a child. And Sudama belonged to a Brahmin family, and he was fairly impoverished even during his childhood. And he grew up and he was still an impoverished Brahmin. He found a wife and he had some children and he was raising them. And by this point, Krishna had already finished his dharma in the city of Mathura, and he had moved to establish his kingdom in the western part of India in a city named Dwaraka that he had built himself. So Krishna had now become this great emperor, and Sudama was still living in Vrindavan in the same place where Krishna grew up, and he was this impoverished Brahmin trying to feed his children, trying to just make his daily bread. And one day his wife tells him, we are struggling so much, we don't even have food to feed our children. I think your friend Krishna has become a big emperor. I keep hearing news about that. Why don't you go ask him for some money? Why don't you just go ask Krishna to help you a little bit so we don't have to struggle so much? And Sudama is very hesitant. He wonders, it just doesn't seem that appropriate in a friendship to be approaching, my dear friend Krishna for something as petty as just wealth. I'm not sure I'm comfortable doing that. But finally, his wife convinces him to do that. Sudama says, I'm going to see Krishna after a long time. I cannot go empty-handed. I need to take something. I don't know what to take. I think as a child, he used to enjoy eating parched rice. In India, sometimes we take rice and you sort of pound the rice to make these rice flakes. You can carry them and they're easier to just chew and eat raw, and they stay without spoiling for a very long time. It's just a poor man's food that you just carry along with you when you don't have anything else. So he says, why don't you make some parched rice? Why don't you take whatever little rice grains we have at home and you just pound them to make this parched rice? I think Krishna used to enjoy that as a child. And so his wife does that, and they don't have much rice at home. So he carries this very little bag of parched rice, and he walks a long way and he reaches Dwaraka finally. And then there he is surprised. He had heard that Krishna was a king and emperor, but he had no idea how much wealth Krishna had. He goes into this palace and he's just completely spellbound with all the glory, all the wealth, and all the beauty that Krishna has created. And he's so overwhelmed, even just being the small Brahmin walking through these corridors of the palace to reach Krishna. And finally, when he's able to meet Krishna, Krishna is just thrilled. Krishna runs from his throne and he comes and hugs Sudama and he says, how thrilled I am to see you, how happy that you have decided to pay me a visit. And then they start chatting, they start talking about childhood. And as Sudama is looking at this palace, as he's walking towards Krishna, he's thinking, no way can I give this bag of parched rice to Krishna. This is just almost insulting. He has all the wealth in this world, and here I am with this few grains of rice that are just dry. You can't even eat them without water. And he holds it back. And then after some time, Krishna says, did you bring anything for me? And then even before Sudama answers, I think you have a bag. Is that parched rice? And then Krishna immediately takes that bag of parched rice and he starts eating it. And Sudama is just, he's of course happy for Krishna to enjoy whatever little gift he brought. And then, the meeting ends cordially and Sudama goes back. And during this whole exchange, Sudama is just so immersed in his love for Krishna and their friendship that they shared, that it does not at all occur to him even that he came here to actually ask Krishna for some wealth, just some little money so he can buy food for his children. And then he starts walking back home. That's when he remembers, oh God, I didn't even ask Krishna all that I came here to ask for. But then he realizes that's what is God's will, and he just goes back to Vrindavan. And after many days of reaching his home, he goes to the town and where he's living, and he's not even able to recognize that part of the town. As he walks, he sees this huge house that is beautifully decorated, and then he enters that house. This is where his hut was. And then he wonders, where is the hut? And he's shocked and concerned. Maybe his family got displaced. And then there he sees this beautiful lady dressed in fine clothes and children playing. And then he approaches that lady, and do I know you? Where is my wife? And where are my children? Where is... And then that lady says, Sudama, I am your wife. Our entire life has changed. Suddenly, we have all this wealth. This just came to us. I didn't even ask. Nobody even came. This all just dropped from the sky. And here we are with all this wealth. Of course, the story is symbolic and just such a beautiful reflection of what it means when we offer ourselves to the Lord and what God can possibly give us when we are that simple and authentic in our devotion. But I remember the most from that story, the handful of parched rice, when Sudama thought, this is not worthy of offering to the Lord. This is not something I want to take to Krishna. He's so big. He's so great. How can I give him something so small? It's not that Krishna needs anything. It's not that you have to feed God because he's hungry. It's not that you have to build him a temple because he does not have a shelter. We have to do this because this is how we offer ourselves up. There's another story in the Ramayana. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. This old lady, Sabari, and she lives in the forest, and she's waiting for ages and ages, waiting for Rama. She started living in this forest hermitage in a hut because one sage once told her that Rama would once pass through this forest and he would come through your hut if you live here. And then she starts residing there, and years pass after years, and then she's an old lady now. She has a hunched back. She cannot even move or walk anymore. And one day, Rama does come. And then she looks around in her hut. There's nothing for her to offer. And then she says to Rama, why don't you wait here? I want to gather something for you. Excuse me. And then she goes to the forest and she picks these wild berries that have dropped from the trees, and she brings a whole bag of them. But these are not berries that are very tasty. These are the kind of berries that you find in the wild that are rather tart, and they're not necessarily as sugary as some of the urban fruits that one might have. And she brings these fruits to Rama, and then she wonders, oh my gosh, some of these fruits are so tart, I really don't want him to eat it. And then she decides that she needs to bite and taste each fruit to make sure it's not too tart for Rama. And so she starts giving him the fruit, but then she realizes, no, I'm not sure I want to give you this. What if it's too sour? I don't want you to have a sour mouth. And then she starts eating those berries one by one and giving those berries to Rama. And Valmiki in the Ramayana describes how beautifully Rama graciously accepts each one of those berries that were actually bitten by this lady already. They're already such tiny berries. You wonder, and we hear all these stories in the scripture, story after story, of the simplest devotion pleasing Lord the most. In Mount Washington, where Yogananda ji lived, there was this devotee who also resided there. I'm not sure what you would call it now. I think you would just say he was somewhere on the spectrum of autistic spectrum or whatever it was. He just was not as put together in his mind. He had a very, very simple outlook to life, and he was not as capable or as socially functioning as some others might have been. And he always served Master, and he lived in Mount Washington. And Swami Kriyananda ji asked once, actually Master told Swami Kriyananda once when he was with him in Mount Washington, he said, Divine Mother is very, very pleased with this man's devotion. And Swami Kriyananda immediately said, knowing who this man was and knowing that his brain was not as complex, he did not have an active mind as most people commonly did, or he was not as philosophical at least. Swami Kriyananda said, oh, that must be a very simple kind of devotion. And Master responded to that by saying, that's what pleases God the most. So, we often don't realize the simplicity, the childlike nature that it takes for us to even express devotion. God is always with us. And we do not need to please Him with anything that we do. We do not need to please God by practices, by rituals, by charity, by things, anything that we can accomplish or do in this world. As hard as it is, we have to bring Him everything. We have to bring Him even our failures. When Yogananda ji met Dr. Lewis, one of the first things he asked in that exchange that they had on Christmas Eve when Yogananda ji accepted Dr. Lewis as a disciple is, he asked Dr. Lewis, Doctor, I need you to promise to me that no matter what happens in your life, even in the hardest of times, even when you're most tempted, you will not turn your back to me. And Doctor said, I had no idea what this promise meant that I was giving him at that moment. Doctor, of course, said, he did not know why that would be so difficult. He said, yes, of course, I will never turn my back. I'll never, ever move away from you. And Dr. Lewis later in his life, he shares how many times, how difficult it was, for a disciple as great as Dr. Lewis, who was so close with Yogananda ji. He says how difficult it was through the many ebbs and flows of life, through all the challenges he faced, how difficult it was to not turn away from Master. And Dr. Lewis said, but I did my best to hold on to that promise. I did not turn my back to Master. And that we learn in our own life. There are so many times when we are tempted, even if we do not have a personal relationship with a guru in the body in the same way as Dr. Lewis did, when we are sad, when we are moody, when we are angry, when we are greedy, when we are jealous, when we are so invested in what's happening with our lives, without our own awareness, we are turning our back. We become indifferent. And that's really what pulls us back spiritually. That's really what holds us back from making progress, not the lack of meditation practice, not really our lack of ability to have deeper experiences in meditation, but truly our indifference. So the more we strive to bring everything to God, the more we are making that effort to be in that communion, always having that conversation, always doing our best to stay in touch with the divine in whatever form, as the Guru, as Krishna, as Jesus, whatever personal form God comes to you. It has to be a personal one-to-one relationship. That's what Krishna is teaching Arjuna in this chapter. More we can foster that relationship, more we can foster that conversation, the more we can always stay in touch with that, the more God is pleased and we are closer to Him. So I'll see you next week with another verse. Until, God bless you all.